Here's an interesting article, Einstein versus Bergson, Science versus Philosophy and the Meaning of Time. Has two different audios in it. An interview with the Harvard historian who researched the article and goes on and is about a episode between Einstein, who was an up-and-coming scientist at the time, and the preeminent philosopher of the time, who was an expert of time. And he was challenging Einstein's interpretation of time and going for a more personal, shall we say, view of time. And I'm going to upload the audio.
I have to say that that day exploded and was referenced over and over again throughout the 20th century. And I think the key sentence here is something that Einstein said. And he said that the time of the philosophers did not exist. And this was extremely scandalous because he had been invited by philosophers. He was speaking at the Société Française de Philosophie, and you had this physicist who was becoming extremely famous say very clearly in these words, the time of the philosophers does not exist. And Bergson, who was present, was clearly outraged.
And what did that mean, the time of the philosophers did not exist?
He basically said that the philosophers based their theories on these psychological ways of understanding time. And the new physical knowledge had proved that these psychological ways of understanding time were really errors of our mind. They were nothing but ideas, that it didn't have an objective reality. The way that physicists understood time did have that objective reality.
Why was this such a problem for Henri Bergson, given that what Einstein was saying was there is an objective rule. I can show you that light goes at a particular speed. There is a time lag, which would mean that two things happening at the same time is not what really happens in objective reality. If he keeps on saying that, why was that an issue for Bergson in regard to the notion of psychological time versus, I guess, real time, for a better word?
One thing is pretty clear. Here's a physicist talking to philosophers, and he's saying, your time, the time that you talk about in your things, is not something that exists in objective reality. So that's sufficiently provocative. Added to that is the fact that Bergson is the expert on time. And the third element is that Bergson really always wanted to think about time in a way that included the human. By that, he meant everyday life, everyday experience, our perception of time in many, many ways. One of the metaphors that he frequently used was we need to think of time in terms of waiting for a lump of sugar to dissolve in a glass of water. That's just one of the examples in which you can see how Bergson was very committed to the view that when we talk about time, we're also talking about humans, and we're talking about human consciousness and human perception. And it is valid to think of time, as the physicists did, as something that's measured by clocks. But he wanted to go beyond that, and he wanted to ask, why do we build clocks in the first place? And he argued that if we didn't have a prior sense of time that was given to us by clocks, we wouldn't have been led to build clocks, and we wouldn't even use them if it wasn't because we wanted to go places and we had certain events that mattered while others didn't matter. So you can see that their point of view is really very different. They had different views about time. They had different views about the role of science and philosophy in the modern world, of this broad division in modernity between the humanities and the sciences.
This is really an interesting article to read and audio to listen to, and I suggest and encourage people, if they would have the time at their leisure, to read the entire article, but I want to draw attention to one particular sentence. That sentence being the quote by Einstein saying that the time of the philosophers did not exist. That sentence set off is this exact sentence that set off the firestorm between him and the philosophical community. In the following video, Stanley Jockey recounts another encounter Einstein had with a well-respected philosopher.
So let's go back to Carnap's visit to Einstein. It was an 18-hour trip by train at that time from Chicago to Princeton. We do not have the tape recording of the conversation because there were no such things at that time. But from Carnap's writing, we can reconstruct of what went on. So, Carnap asked Einstein, can physics demonstrate the existence of the now in order to make the notion of now into a scientifically valid term? Einstein's answer was categorical. He said, the experience of the now cannot be turned into an object of physical measurement. It can never be part of physics. This, of course, followed from the conviction widely shared by Einstein and by other physicists that relativity theory has abolished simultaneity. Relativity theory did not do anything of that sort. It is argued that any measurement of the moment of the now is already a moment of the past by the time the data of measurements reach the observer.
And here is an interesting article by Stanley Jockey called The Mind in Its Now. And you can read more full definition of what he means, and I'll highlight some here. There can be no active mind without its sensing its existence in the moment called now. There is no physical parallel to the mind's ability to extend from its position in the momentary present to its past moments, or in its ability to imagine its future. The mind remains identical with itself while it lives through its momentary nows. The now is immensely richer in experience than any marvelous set of numbers. Even if science could give an account of the set of numbers in terms of energy levels, the now is not a number. It is rather a word, the most decisive of all words. It is through experiencing that word that the mind comes alive and registers all existence around and well beyond. All our moments, all our nows flow into a personal continuum of which the supreme form is the now, which is uncreated because it simply is. And here is an excerpt of Carnap's autobiography where he goes over the incident. I want to draw attention to one sentence here as well as two other sentences in the first article and in the second article. In the first article, we saw the sentence that set off the entire firestorm. The time of the philosophers did not exist. And then later on with Carnap, we found Einstein said the experience of the now cannot be turned into an object of physical measurement. It can never be a part of physics. And then, again, in Carnap we have that this experience cannot be grasped by science, seemed to him a matter of painful but inevitable resignation. In the following article, we find that Einstein even went so far as to deny that he had free will. That Einstein would deny that the now of the mind is not an object of physical measurement, and even deny that he had free will was an interesting claim for Einstein to make, because advances in science, particularly in quantum mechanics, have overturned his interpretation of time and have established that the now is much more a product of physical measurement than Einstein could have ever imagined. In this experiment, the claim that past material states determine future conscious choices, determinism, is directly falsified by the fact that present conscious choices are, in fact, affecting past material states. It states here, within a naive classical worldview, quantum mechanics can even mimic an influence of future actions on past events. In other words, if my conscious choices really are just merely the result of whatever state the material particles in my brain happen to be in the past, deterministic, how in blue blazes are my choices instantaneously affecting the state of material particles into the past? This experiment is simply impossible for any coherent materialistic presupposition. Here's another experiment along the same line. In this proposed experiment, it is said, if you have space-time, you have a well-defined causal order. But if you don't have a well-defined causal order, as is the case in the experiments he has proposed, then you don't have space-time. Quantum correlations come first, space-time later. Exactly how does space-time emerge out of the quantum world? Berners said he is still unsure. There are several more experiments along the same line that could be referenced, but this article gets the gist of it across. Thus, the fact that quantum mechanics applies on all scales forces us to confront the theory's deepest mysteries. We cannot simply write them off as mere details that matter only on the very smallest scales. For instance, space and time are two of the most fundamental classical concepts, but according to quantum mechanics, they are secondary. The entanglements are primary. They interconnect quantum systems without reference to space and time. If there were a dividing line between the quantum and the classical worlds, we could use the space and time of the classical world to provide a framework for describing quantum process. But without such a dividing line, and indeed without a truly classical world, we lose this framework. We must explain space and time as somehow emerging from fundamentally spaceless and timeless physics. Although I skipped over a lot, try to make it as simple as possible, let me sum up the video like this. The now as philosophers term it, and contrary to what Einstein thought possible for experimental physics, and according to advances in quantum mechanics, the now takes precedence over past events in time. Moreover, due to advances in quantum mechanics, it would now be much more appropriate to phrase Einstein's answers to the philosopher in this way. It is impossible for the experience of the now to ever be divorced from physical measurement. It will always be a part of physics. I apologize for the sloppiness of the video and for skipping over a bunch of stuff, but hopefully it is now clear that Einstein was wrong in his disagreement with the philosophers, and that the philosophers were correct that the time, the now of human experience takes precedence over the space-time of Einstein's framework. And that was the main point of the video. Hopefully that point came across clearly. Thanks for watching the video.